kosher eggs. So as we all know, what comes from an animal, that is going to be the same status of that animal. So we have a cow, for example. The milk that comes out of that cow is going to be kosher, provided that the cow didn't have any treifa, didn't have anything that would invalidate it from being kosher. The same thing would be concerning eggs, that eggs that come from a chicken is kosher, eggs that come from an eagle is non-kosher, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to making eggs kosher, the first thing we got to know is from which animals is coming from. So once we verify that it's coming from a chicken, for example, well, that's the most common one, then we have that out of the way. The next part is, once the eggs get cracked, there are many companies that take raw eggs in the shell. They have a machine that cracks the egg, and then the egg just falls into a receptacle, and then it gets pumped into a tank, and from that storage tank it gets put on either on a truck or in a tote. So the first question is, how about the blood spots? So the OU has an article all about blood spots, how it's not really applicable today, because the chickens that are in the barns are all hens that are not connected to any roosters. So even the blood spots that come from these chickens is a non-issue. On top of that, these companies that crack eggs are cracking in the thousands. So even if there's a blood spot, it's totally nullified. There's something called in Hebrew bittul. There's bittul b'shishim, bittul b'elef, which means that, let's say you have a pot of chicken soup and a little tiny drop of milk falls in, it's fine because it's nullified. You shouldn't do that in the first place. But if by mistake a drop of milk falls into a pot of chicken soup, it is fine. So you're going to say, well, they're doing it on purpose. They are cracking the eggs and there's blood spots there. So that brings us to the next halacha. A non-Jew could go ahead and have something nullified in the first place. The other thing that's in place is that they have systems in these factories to look out for any eggs that have blood spots in them. They have a machine called the candling. That means even before the egg is even cracked, they could look through the eggs and see if there's any blood spots in the eggs, and if the workers find such an egg, they could easily just push it off the line. Furthermore, when the egg gets cracked, so there's a little cup that collects the yolk, and then the egg white falls to the bottom. So while the egg yolk is still on the cup and it's moving, because everything is on a conveyor belt, as it's moving down, the workers could check the egg yolk because it's right there in front of them exposed. And if they see any blood spot, just with a flick of a finger, they could dump that egg yolk into the waste. So we have many things in place, all to make sure that blood spots are not an issue. Now there are some of these factories where they simply just crack eggs, and as mentioned before, they have the ability to separate the egg white from the egg yolk. So some of them would just ship out straight raw egg in a yolk. That means just egg yolk separately. They're able to have that get pumped into a dedicated storage tank, or they could have just egg white, or they could have whole egg, which is the yolk and the white. So that's the most simplest ones. That's all what they're doing day in and day out. They're taking eggs, they're breaking it, and then they ship it off to bakeries and whatnot. When it gets complicated is when they pasteurize the eggs. So if it's raw, just straight raw eggs, as mentioned, that's the easiest and simplest. But the moment they start pasteurizing, that's where it gets complicated, because if they are doing a scrambled egg mix, which is very common in many factories where restaurants want to have a already pre-blended liquid egg mix, where you have where you have powdered milk and flavorings and salt, pepper and whatnot, all mixed in to the mix, and all they have to take is just open up the container and they could make their scrambled eggs. So if they are running dairy and non-dairy in the same line, it could be problematic. How is that done? There's something that's called a CIP, or otherwise known as cleaning in place. That is, every single company has a cleaning procedure. Whenever they're running something, and let's say they get to the end of the day, at the end of the day they need to clean everything up. So we're talking here about a pasteurizer. Without getting all complicated how a pasteurizer works, you basically have a plate, it's called a plate and frame, where the product goes on one side and you have like a hot water on the other side heating the product, and then there's a cooling side. But I want to focus here how it is kosherized, and that is when they are running egg through the pasteurizer, and then they get done running it, so then they take hot water and they run it through the line. They basically do what's called a hot water rinse. So ideally there is supposed to be a 24-hour downtime between running dairy and running non-dairy. That's most of the time not possible, because many of these plants are very busy. They have very, very busy schedules. So instead, we do what's called a double koshering, and that is that when they introduce hot water through the pasteurizer, they mix it with a caustic, or as we call in halacha, davar hapoigim, something that ruins and fouls the flavor of whatever dairy is in that pasteurizer. And the temperature could vary anywhere between 195 or 212, depending which kosher agency you talk to. But the most common one is to get it above 200 degrees. And the initial hot water rinse contains in it, as we said, caustic. Then it's followed by just a straight hot water rinse, and that's what we call the second koshering. And in certain cases, the mashgiach must be present when this is done. But the most common one is that mashgiach doesn't need to be there while they are doing this, what we call a kosherization. Rather, the mashgiach looks at the charts. Maybe in another video I could show you how one of these charts look. Basically, it's round. It's the only paper out there that you'll find in a perfectly round circle. You go into Office Depot, the only paper that you'll find is square, whether it's 11.5 by 17 or the 8.5 by 11, which is the most common size used. But they have a special paper. I don't even think you could get it in Office Depot. It's a round chart, and that is there's a pen that writes in the temperature. As the temperature rises, it goes around the circle, and you could see if it has reached that temperature. So let's go on to egg production. Up until now, we're speaking about liquid eggs. The next egg product is French toast. And that is, we all know what French toast is, but for those that don't know, you make an egg solution where there's liquid eggs, there's salt, sugar, butter flavored, there could be cinnamon and whatnot. And then you have your bread. The bread gets dipped into this liquid egg solution, and then it goes on into a conveyor belt oven. So it gets cooked. So most of the time, French toast are dairy because of the flavor and milk powder that goes into it. So that's really not a problem. I've never seen a non-kosher flavored French toast. So that's pretty short and simple, where I just need to make sure, meaning the mashgiach and kashrut, need to make sure that the ingredients going into the solution is kosher. Now, sometimes you could have a pasteurizer that they use both for dairy and non-dairy. So let's say you have in the same factory, they're doing liquid eggs, just straight liquid eggs, like we mentioned previously, but a couple of 100 feet in that same factory, they could be running French toast. So you might say, well, look, it's a whole separate line. Here they're running French toast, and here they're doing liquid eggs. Well, not so simple. What if they're using the same pasteurizer? So you got to make sure that they're doing a proper kosherization. Then we have egg patties. And that is places like Starbucks, where they want a ready-made, perfectly round-shaped egg patty, so they could quickly go and put it into a sandwich and heat it up for the customer on the spot, on the go. So I mentioned Starbucks, and Starbucks are not kosher certified for their sandwiches. You could go onto the CRC website. They have a whole write-up about Starbucks drinks, but that's for another discussion. I'm talking here about the Starbucks sandwiches. Anyways, I'm not sure why I mentioned that. Let's say there's a kosher establishment. Let's say there's a hospital or a prison that they also want a ready-made egg patties. So in such a factory, they would take, similar to what we mentioned before, a scrambled egg mix, which is liquid egg, milk powder, flavorings and whatnot, and then they put it through an oven. And on the oven, it's a conveyor belt, and they have on a conveyor mini pans, like these, imagine little frying pans, like 10 in a row on a metal flat surface, and then you have a whole bunch of them attached to each other, and it just flows through the oven and gets baked or cooked and then it comes out the other end fully cooked. So if it's just straight scrambled egg mix, it should be no problem. Again, the mashgiach just needs to look at the ingredients. Where it could get tricky is if they're mixing in shredded cheese. You see, in kosher dairy, straight milk is 100% kosher. I'm not speaking about chalav yisrael. That's for another discussion. We're talking here just regular kosher milk, as mentioned before, that comes from a cow, is 100% kosher. If they take that milk and they dry it into a powder, well, you got to make sure that the facility where they're drying this powder, make sure that they're not drying anything else that's not kosher there, or if they do, make sure they're doing a proper kosherization. Cream cheese is also, it's not a problem, as long as there's a mashgiach there. He makes sure the ingredients that are mixed with the cream cheese are all kosher. The same goes with yogurt. Any liquid or even cream based milk is all fine. The moment you make something into a hard cheese, it comes what we call this gevinas akum. And that is, even somebody that does not keep chalav yisrael, but he cannot consume any cheese, hard cheese I'm talking about, that the mashgiach did not put in the rennet into the vats where they're actually making the cheese, without going into to a whole long explanation, this is what the Chacham have decided, that the only way for hard cheese to be kosher is that the rennet must be placed into that by the mashgiach. Again, no matter if it's cholav Yisrael or not. So that poses a big problem, because the prices of kosher, regular kosher hard cheese is much higher than non-kosher shredded cheese, because as mentioned before, and I'll say it again, to have regular kosher cholav akum kosher cheese, the mashgiach must be there to put in their rennet. So in a factory where they're doing egg patties and they're putting in shredded cheese, they're going to want to use the non-kosher cheese one, unless they have a demand in the market for them to use kosher cheese. They're going to want to use the non-kosher cheese, and that poses a big problem. And the way to get around it is that they have to order another set of egg molds. That's what they call them. Again, those little mini frying pans. So they have one that they use for kosher, and then they have a whole nother set that they need to change out, that they use that for non-kosher, and the mashgiach needs to be on top of it and make sure that these two sets of pans are segregated and never ever get mixed up. And then so there's really two things here. There's the oven chamber, and then there's the pans that the egg patties are going on. So the pans itself, really, ideally, they should be koshered, and that is through taking a blowtorch. But these egg pans, are made from aluminum, and it's very hard to properly kosher them without warping them. So that's why I said you just have a whole nother set for kosher, and a whole nother set of pans for non-kosher. Now for the chamber of the oven itself, you simply turn on the flame of the oven, make sure it reaches around 500 degrees for about 2 hours or so. Contact your local rabbi exactly for how many hours and for how long, and then your oven is kosher.